Hey everybody, Deep Green here. Night from New York, from where I am, back in my humble abode. So as you can see, hopefully everybody's doing well. As you can see, at first things first, got my Wear the Peace Free Palestine shirt, hoodie. Got that going on right now. So we got that going on right now. Yeah, let's get to it. Like I said, the book I've been reading and for my own political education, and again, I said, I wish I discovered this person sooner. Michael Parenti, Blackshirts and Reds. I'm reading Ch.2. It's been such an informative read so far, to say the least, because they try to make you rationalize, especially in the U.S. here. They'll try to make you rationalize, try to accept fascism in a sense. Oh, socialism bad, but they'll tell you what we got going on here is great, but it's fascism, straight pure fascism, and we're in the end stage of capitalism. So I figure, let's get into it. So this is Ch.2. Let us now praise revolution. If you are in the stream, say hi and enjoy what we can enjoy. Ch.2. Let us now praise revolution. For most of this century, U.S. foreign policy has been devoted to the suppression of revolutionary governments and radical movements around the world. The turn of the 20th century found the McKinley administration in a war of attrition against the people of the Philippines lasting from 1898 to 1902, with pockets of resistance continuing for years afterward. In that conflict, U.S. forces slaughtered some 200,000 Filipino women, men, and children. At about that same time, in conjunction with various European colonial powers, the United States invaded China to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion at substantial loss of life to the Chinese rebels. U.S. forces took over Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and in the following decades invaded Mexico, Soviet Russia, Nicaragua, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and other countries, actions that usually inflicted serious losses upon the populations of these countries. The costs of counter-revolution. From grade school through grad school, few of us are taught anything about these events, except to be told that U.S. forces must intervene in this or that country in order to protect U.S. interests, thwart aggression, and defend our national security. U.S. leaders fashioned other convenient rationales for their interventions abroad. The public was told that the peoples of various countries were in need of our civilizing guidance and desired the blessings of democracy, peace, and prosperity. To accomplish this, of course, it might be necessary to kill off considerable numbers of the more recalcitrant among them. Such were the measures of our policymakers were willing to pursue in order to uplift lesser peoples. The emergence of major communist powers like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China lent another dimension to U.S. global counter-revolutionary policy. The communists were depicted as evil incarnate, demonized conspirators who sought power for power's sake. The United States had to be everywhere to counteract this spreading cancer, we were told. In the name of democracy, U.S. leaders waged a merciless war against revolutionaries in Indochina for the better part of 20 years. They dropped many times more tons of explosives on Vietnam than were used throughout World War II by all combatants combined. Testifying before a congressional committee, former CIA Director William Colby admitted that under his direction, U.S. forces and their South Vietnam collaborators carried out the selective assassination of 24,000 Vietnamese dissidents in what was known as the Phoenix Program. His associate, the South Vietnamese Minister of Information, maintained that 40,000 was a more accurate estimate. U.S. policymakers and their media mouthpieces judged the war a mistake because the Vietnamese proved incapable of being properly instructed by B-52 bomber raids and death squads. By prevailing against this onslaught, the Vietnamese supposedly demonstrated that they were unprepared for our democratic institutions. In pursuit of counter-revolution, and in the name of freedom, U.S. forces or U.S.-supported surrogate forces slaughtered 2 million North Koreans in a 3-year war, 3 million Vietnamese, over 500,000 in aerial wars over Laos and Cambodia, over 1.5 million in Angola, over 1 million in Mozambique, over 500,000 in Afghanistan, 500,000 to 1 million in Indonesia, 200,000 in East Timor, 100,000 in Nicaragua, including the Somoza and Reagan eras, over 100,000 in Guatemala, plus an additional 40,000 disappeared, over 700,000 in Iraq, over 60,000 in El Salvador, 30,000 in the dirty war of Argentina, though the government admits to only 9,000. 35,000 in Taiwan, when the Kuomintang military arrived from China. 20,000 in Chile, and many thousands in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Western Sahara, Zaire, Turkey, and dozens of other countries in what amounts to a free market world holocaust. Official sources either deny these U.S.-sponsored mass murders or justify them as necessary measures that had to be taken against an implacable communist foe. Anti-communist propaganda saturated our airways, schools, and political discourse. Despite repeated and often fictitious references to the tyranny of the Red Menace, the anti-communist opinion makers never spelled out what communists actually did in the way of socio-economic policy. This might explain why, despite decades of red-bashing propaganda, most Americans, including many who number themselves among the political cognoscenti, still cannot offer an informed statement about the social policies of communist societies. The anti-red propagandist uttered nary a word about how revolutionaries in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua, and other countries nationalized the lands held by rich exploitative landlords and initiated mass programs for education, health, housing, and jobs. Not a word about how their efforts advanced the living standards and life chances of hundreds of millions in countries that had long suffered under the yoke of feudal oppression and Western colonial pillage. And an improvement in mass well-being never before witnessed in history. No matter what the revolutionaries in various Asian, African, and Latin American countries enjoyed, no matter that the revolutionaries in various Asian, African, and Latin American countries enjoyed popular support and were willing to pursue a neutralist course in East-West relations rather than place themselves under the hegemony of either Moscow or Peking. they still were targeted for a counter-revolutionary battering. From opposing communists because they might be revolutionaries, it was a short step to opposing revolutionaries because they might be communists. The real sin of revolutionaries, communists or not, was that they championed the laboring classes against the wealthy few. They advocated changes in the distribution of class power and the way wealth was produced and used. They wanted less individualistic advancement at the expense of the many and collective betterment for the entire working populace. Presumptions of power. Ruling classes throughout the world hate and fear communism, not for its lack of political democracy, but because it attempts to establish economic democracy by building an egalitarian collectivist social system, though they rarely come right out and say as much. This counter-revolutionary interventionist policy rests on several dubious assumptions that might be stated and rebutted as follows. Number 1. U.S. leaders have the right to define the limits of socio-economic development within other nations. Not true. Under no canon of international law or any other legal stricture do the leaders of this country have the right to ordain what kind of economic system or mode of social development another country may adopt. No more right than do the leaders of other countries have to dictate such things to the United States. In practice, the option to dictate is exercised by the strong over the weak, a policy of might, not right. Number 2, the United States must play a counter-revolutionary containment role in order to protect our national interest. This is true only if we equate our national interests with the investment interests of high finance. U.S. interventionism has been very effective in building neo-imperialism, keeping the land, labor, natural resources, and markets of third world countries available at bargain prices to multinational corporations. But these corporate interests do not represent the interests of the U.S. people. The public pays for the huge military budgets and endures the export of its jobs to foreign labor markets. The inflow of thousands of impoverished immigrants who compete for scarce employment and housing, and various other costs of empire. Furthermore, revolutionary governments like Cuba, Libya, Vietnam, and North Korea were, and still are, eager to trade and maintain peaceful relations with this country. These countries do not threaten the national security of the United States or its people, but the overseas interests of global capitalism. If allowed to multiply in numbers, countries with an alternative socialist system, one that uses the land, labor, capital, and natural resources in collectivist ways, placing people before profits, would eventually undermine global capitalism. Number 3. The United States has a moral obligation to guarantee the stability of nations that are undergoing democratic development but are threatened by revolutionaries and terrorists. In fact, most U.S. interventions are on behalf of corrupt and self-serving oligarchs and anti-democratic militarists who take power with or without the benefit of U.S.-sponsored showcase elections. Third world oligarchs are frequently educated at elite U.S. universities or end up on the CIA payroll, as do their police chiefs and military officers, many of whom receive training in torture and assassination at U.S. counterinsurgency institutions. 4. Fundamental social change should be peacefully pursued within the established order of nations rather than by revolutionary turmoil. U.S. policymakers maintain that they favor eliminating mass poverty in poorer countries and that they are not opposed to the laudatory objectives of social revolution, but to its violent methods. They say that transformations must be effected gradually and peacefully, preferably through private investment and the benign workings of the free market. In fact, corporate investment is more likely to deter rather than encourage reform by preempting markets and restructuring the local economy to fit foreign capital extraction needs. International finance capital has no interest in bettering the life chances of third world peoples. Generally, as Western investments have increased in the third world, life conditions for the ordinary peasants and workers have grown steadily more desperate. Whose violence? People throughout the world do not need more corporate investments. Rather, they need the opportunity to wrest back their land, labor, natural resources, and markets in order to serve their own social needs. Such a revolutionary development invites fierce opposition from apostles of the free market, whose violent resistance to social change makes peaceful transformation impossible to contemplate. Even in countries like the United States, where reforms of limited scope have been achieved without revolution, the peaceful means employed have entailed popular struggle and turmoil, and a considerable amount of violence and bloodshed, almost all of it inflicted by police and security forces. That last point frequently goes unmentioned in discussions about the ethics of revolutionary violence. The very concept of revolutionary violence is somewhat falsely cast, since most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling for reform. By focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchs to maintain the status quo, including armed attacks against peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests, torture, destruction of opposition organizations, suppression of dissident publications, death squad assassinations, the extermination of whole villages, and the like. Most social revolutions begin peacefully. Why would it be otherwise? Who would not prefer to assemble and demonstrate rather than engage in mortal combat against pitiless forces that enjoy every advantage in mobility and firepower? Revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam, and El Salvador all began peacefully, with crowds of peasants and workers launching nonviolent protests, only to be met with violent oppression from the authorities. Peaceful protest and reform are exactly what the people are denied by the ruling oligarchs. The dissidents who continue to fight back, who try to defend themselves from the oligarchs' repressive fury, are then called violent revolutionaries and terrorists. For those local and international elites who maintain control over most of the world's wealth, social revolution is an abomination. Whether it be peaceful or violent is a question of no great moment to them. Peaceful reforms that infringe upon their profitable accumulations and threaten their class privileges are as unacceptable to them as the social upheaval imposed by revolution. Reforms that advance the conditions of life for the general public are not as materially intractable or as dependent on capital resources as we have been led to believe. There is no great mystery to building a health clinic or carrying out programs for food rationing, land redistribution, literacy, jobs, and housing. Such tasks are well within the capacity of any state, if there is the political will and the mobilization of popular class power. Consider Kerala, a state in India where the actions of popular organizations and mass movements have won important victories over the last 40 years against political economic oppression, generating a level of social development considerably better than that found in most of the third world, and accomplished without outside investment. Kerala has mass literacy, a lower birth rate, and a lower death rate than the rest of India, better public health services, fewer child workers, higher nutritional levels, thanks to a publicly subsidized food rationing system, more enlightened legal support and educational programs for women, and some social security protections for working people and for the destitute and physically handicapped. In addition, the people of Kerala radically altered a complex and exploitative system of agrarian relations and won important victories against the more horrid forms of caste oppression. Though Kerala has no special sources of wealth, it has had decades of communist organizing and political struggle that reached and moved large numbers of people and breathed life into the state's democracy. Despite its relatively short periods in the leadership of government, it is the Communist Party that has set the basic legislative agenda of the people of Kerala, notes Indian scholar V.K. Ramachandran. All this is not to deny that many people in Kerala endure unacceptable conditions of poverty. Still, despite a low level of income and limited resources, the achievements wrought by democratic government intervention and propelled by mass action have been substantial, representing the difference between a modestly supportable existence and utter misery. Many third world peoples produce dedicated and capable popular organizations, as did the communists in Kerala, but they are usually destroyed by repressive state forces. In Kerala, popular agitation and input took advantage of democratic openings and in turn gave more social substance to the democracy. What is needed for social betterment is not international monetary fund loans or corporate investments, but political organization and democratic opportunity, and freedom from U.S.-sponsored state terrorism. U.S. foreign aid programs offer another example of how imperialist policy masquerades as social reform within third world nations. Aid programs are not intended to effect serious social betterment. At best, they finance piecemeal projects of limited impact. More often, they are used to undermine local markets, drive small farmers off their land, build transportation and office facilities needed by outside investors, increase a country's debt and economic dependency, and further open its economy to multinational corporate penetration. Free market for the few. Third world revolutionaries are branded as the enemies of stability. Stability is a code word for a society in which privileged social relations are securely entrenched. When popular forces mobilize against privilege and wealth, this causes instability, which is judged to be undesirable by U.S. policymakers and their faithful flacks in the U.S. corporate media. Here we have a deceptive state of affairs. What poses as a U.S. commitment to peaceful nonviolent change is really a commitment to the violent defense of an unjust, undemocratic global capitalism. The U.S. national security state uses coercion and violence not in support of social reform, but against it, all in the name of stability, counterterrorism, democracy, and of late, and more honestly, the free market. When he was head of the State Department policy planning staff during the early years of the Cold War, the noted author George Kennan revealed the ruthless realpolitik mentality of those dedicated to social inequality within and between nations. Kennan maintained that a wealthy United States facing an impoverished world could not afford the luxury of altruism and world benefaction, and should cease talking about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Speaking at a briefing for U.S. ambassadors to Latin America, Keenan remarked, "The final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists." In a 1949 State Department intelligence report, Kennan wrote that communists were people who are committed to the belief that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people, so they had to be dealt with harshly without regard for such niceties as democratization and human rights. It is said that the United States cannot renege on its commitments to other peoples and must continue as world leader. The rest of the world expects that of us, but the ordinary peoples of the world have never called for U.S. world leadership. Quite the contrary. They usually want the United States to go home and leave them to their own affairs. This is because U.S. commitments are not to the ordinary people of other lands, but to the privileged reactionary factions that are most accommodating to Western investors. As Kennan's remarks indicate, the U.S. policy-making establishment has been concerned not with advancing the welfare of impoverished peoples around the world, but with defeating whoever allies themselves with the common people, be they Reds or not. Whatever their grave shortcomings, do not U.S.-supported Third World rulers represent something better than the kind of tyranny that communists and revolutionary totalitarians bring? Academic cheerleaders for U.S. interventionism, such as Samuel P. Huntington of Harvard University, think so. However bad a given evil may be, a worse one is always possible and often likely, Huntington concludes. Going on to defend as lesser evils the murderous regimes in Chile under Pinochet and South Africa under apartheid. We might recall John Kirkpatrick's distinction between benign authoritarian right-wing governments that supposedly are not all that brutal and allow gradual change, and hard totalitarian left-wing ones that suppress everyone. The real distinction is that the right-wing government maintains the existing privileged order of the free market, keeping the world safe for the empowered hierarchies and wealthy classes of the world. In contrast, the left-wing totalitarians want to abolish exploitative property relations and create a more egalitarian economic system. Their favoring the have-nots over the haves is what makes them so despicable in the eyes of the latter. U.S. leaders claim to be offended by certain features of social revolutionary governments, such as one-party rule and the coercive implementation of revolutionary change. But one-party autocracy is acceptable if the government is rightist, that is, friendly towards private and corporate investments such as Turkey, Zaire, Guatemala, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries, including even communist countries that are sliding down the free market path, such as China. We might recall that unforgettable moment when President George Bush, whose invasions of Panama and Iraq brought death and destruction to those nations who presided over a U.S. military empire that is the single greatest purveyor of violence in the world, lectured revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela on the virtues of nonviolence, even going so far as to quote Martin Luther King Jr. during Mandela's visit to Washington, D.C. in June 1990. Mandela's real sin in Bush's eyes was that he was part of a revolutionary movement that engaged in armed struggle against the violently repressive apartheid regime in South Africa. Bush's capacity for selective perception had all the examined audacity of a dominant ideology that condemns only those who act against an unjust status quo, not those who use violence to preserve it. It would come as a great relief to people around the world if the President of the United States had adopted a policy of nonviolence for his own government. In fact, he had done no such thing. The freedom of revolution. U.S. political economic leaders may find revolutionary reforms undesirable, but most people who live in revolutionary societies find them preferable to the old regimes and worth defending. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was a fiasco not because of insufficient air coverage, but because the Cuban people closed ranks behind their government and threw back the invaders. Another captive people, the North Vietnamese, acted in similar fashion in the early 1970s. Instead of treating the severe destruction and disruptions caused by the U.S. aerial war against their country as a golden opportunity to throw Hanoi's yoke, they continued to support their beleaguered government at great sacrifice to themselves. And in South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front enjoyed tactical opportunities for supply and surprise, largely because it was supported by people in the countryside and cities. During the Vietnam era, explanations as to why people sided with the communist revolutionaries came from some unexpected sources. U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge admitted the only people who have been doing anything for the little man to lift him up have been the communists. In a similar vein, one faithful propagator of the official line, columnist James Reston, wrote with surprising candor, even Premier Kai, U.S.-sponsored dictator of South Vietnam, told this reporter today that the communists were closer to the people's yearnings for social justice and an independent life than his own government. What Lodge and Reston left unsaid was that the little man and the people's yearnings for social justice were the very things that U.S. leaders were bent on suppressing. Some people conclude that anyone who utters a good word about leftist one-party revolutions must harbor anti-democratic or Stalinist elements. But to applaud social revolutions is not to oppose political freedom. To the extent that revolutionary governments construct substantive alternatives for their people, they increase human options and freedom. There is no such thing as freedom in the abstract. There is freedom to speak openly and iconoclastically, freedom to organize a political opposition, freedom of opportunity to get an education and to pursue a livelihood, freedom to worship as one chooses or not worship at all, freedom to live in healthful conditions, freedom to enjoy various social benefits, and so on. Most of what is called freedom gets its definition within a social context. Revolutionary governments extend a number of popular freedoms without destroying those freedoms that never existed in the previous regimes. They foster conditions necessary for national self-determination, economic betterment, the preservation of health and human life, and the end of many of the worst forms of ethnic patriarchal and class oppression. Regarding patriarchal oppression, consider the vastly improved condition of women in revolutionary Afghanistan and South Yemen before the counter-revolutionary repression in the 1990s, or in Cuba after the 1959 revolution as compared to before. U.S. policymakers argue that social revolutionary victory anywhere represents a diminution of freedom in the world. The assertion is false. The Chinese Revolution did not crush democracy. There was none to crush in that oppressively feudal regime. The Cuban Revolution did not destroy freedom. It destroyed a hateful U.S.-sponsored police state. The Algerian Revolution did not abolish national liberties. Precious few existed under French colonialism. The Vietnamese revolutionaries did not abrogate individual rights. No such rights were available under the U.S.-supported puppet governments of Bao Dai, Diem, and Cai. Of course, revolutions do limit the freedoms of the corporate property class and other privileged interests. The freedom to invest privately without regard to human and environmental costs. The freedom to live in obscene opulence while paying workers starvation wages. The freedom to treat the state as a private agency in the service of a privileged coterie. The freedom to employ child labor and child prostitutes. The freedom to treat women as chattel, and so on. Today, no one in U.S. policy circles worries about the political economic repression suffered in dozens of right-wing client states. Their professed desire to bring Western political democracy to nations that have had revolutions rarely extends to free market autocracies. And the grudging moves toward political democracy occasionally made in these autocracies come only through popular pressure and rebellion, and only with the unspoken understanding that democratic governance will not infringe substantially upon the interests of the moneyed class. What measure of pain? Is the pain of revolution worth the gain? Cost-benefit accounting is a complicated business when applied to social transitions. But have we ever bothered to compare the violence of revolution against the violence that preceded it? I do not know how one measures the price of historical victories, said Robert Heilbronner. I only know that the way in which we ordinarily keep the books of history is wrong. We make no tally of the generations claimed by the combination of economic exploitation and political suppression so characteristic of the ancient regimes that the hapless victims of flood and famine in the Yangtze Valley of yesterday. The child prostitutes found dead in the back alleys of old Shanghai. The music stricken by cold and starvation across the frozen steppes of Russia. And what of today? No one is tallying the thousands of nameless victims who succumbed to U.S.-trained torturers in Latin America, the hundreds of villages burned by counterinsurgency forces, the millions who are driven from their ancestral lands and sentenced to permanently stunted and malnourished lives, the millions more who perish in the desperate misery and congestion of shanty slums and internment camps. Their sufferings go unrecorded and are not figured into the balance when the revolution metes out justice to erstwhile oligarchs and oppressors or commits excesses and abuses of its own. And how do we measure the pain of the tens of millions of children throughout the world, many as young as 6 and 7, who are forced to work 70 hours a week, confined in ill-lit, poorly ventilated workshops under conditions reminiscent of the most horrific days of the Industrial Revolution? The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, a sweeping multinational free trade act that amounts to a carte blanche for global capitalism, offers no protection for children who are exploited, abused, overworked, and underpaid. During GATT negotiations, leaders of the third world countries successfully argued against participating in restrictions on child labor, arguing that children have always worked in their cultures and such traditional practices should be respected. To prohibit child labor would limit the free market and affect a severe hardship on those poor families in which a child is often the only wage earner. Even if the long-standing practice of children helping out on farms is acceptable, assuming they are not overworked and are allowed to go to school, the practice of locking them into a hot box of a factory for 14 hours a day is something else. Furthermore, they may be the only wage earner because adult workers have been laid off in favor of children, who are infinitely more exploitable and provide bigger profits for prosperous factory owners. Traveling across Cuba in 1959, immediately after the overthrow of the U.S.-supported right-wing Batista dictatorship, Mike Faulkner witnessed a spectacle of almost unrelieved poverty. The rural population lived in makeshift shacks without minimal sanitation. Malnourished children went barefoot in the dirt and suffered the familiar plague of parasites common to the third world. There were almost no doctors or schools. And through much of the year, families that depended solely on the seasonal sugar harvested lived close to starvation. How does that victimization in pre-revolutionary Cuba measure against the more widely publicized repression that came after the revolution? When Castro's communists executed a few hundred of the previous regime's police assassins and torturers, drove assortment upper-class money bags into exile, and intimidated various other opponents of radical reforms into silence. Today, Cuba is a different place. For all its mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution brought sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing, and human services to a level not found throughout most of the third world and in many parts of the first world. Infant mortality in Cuba has dropped from 60%, 60 per 1,000 in 1967 to 9.7 per 1,000 in 1991, while life expectancy rose from 55 to 75 in that same period. Smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid, polio, and numerous other diseases have been wiped out by improving living standards and public health programs. Cuba has enjoyed a level of literacy higher than in the United States and a life expectancy that compares well with advanced industrial nations. Other peoples besides the Cubans have benefited. As Fidel Castro tells it, the Cuban Revolution has sent teachers, doctors, and workers to dozens of third world countries without charging a penny. It shed its own blood fighting colonialism, fighting apartheid, and fascism. At one point, we had 25,000 third world students studying on scholarships. We still have many scholarship students from Africa and other countries. In addition, our country has treated more children, 13,000, who were victims of the Chernobyl tragedy than all other countries put together. They don't talk about that, and that's why they blockade us. The country with the most teachers per capita of all countries in the world, including developed countries. The country with the most doctors per capita of all countries, one for every 214 inhabitants. The country with the most art instructors per capita of all countries in the world. The country with the most sports instructors in the world. That gives you an idea of the effort involved. A country where life expectancy is more than 75 years. Why are they blockading Cuba? Because no other country has done more for its people. It's the hatred of the ideas that Cuba represents. Cuba's sin in the eyes of global capitalists is not its lack of democracy. Most third world capitalist regimes are far more repressive. Cuba's real sin is that it has tried to develop an alternative to the global capitalist system, an egalitarian social-economic order that placed corporate property under public ownership, abolished capitalist investors as a class entity, and put people before profits and national independence before IMF servitude. So a conservative think tank like the Heritage Foundation rated Cuba, along with Laos, Iraq, and North Korea, as countries with the lowest level of economic freedom. Countries with a high level of economic freedom were those that imposed little or no taxes or regulations on business, and did without wage protections, price controls, environmental safeguards, and benefits for the poor. Economic freedom is the real concern of conservatives and plutocrats. The freedom to utilize vast sums of money to accumulate still vaster sums, regardless of the human and environmental costs. Mass productivity coupled with elitist distribution results in more wealth for the few and greater poverty for the many. So after 2 centuries of incredible technological development and unprecedented economic expansion, the number of people living in poverty in the capitalist world has grown more quickly than any other demographic cohort. The world's slum population has increased at a far greater rate than the total global population. Amazing growth in industrial productivity has been accompanied by increasingly desperate want, misery, and repression. In short, there's a causal link between vast concentrations of wealth and widespread poverty. The next time someone preaches the free market gospel of economic freedom and productivity, we need to ask, for whose benefit and at whose costs? Those who show concern for the elites overthrown in the whirl of revolution should also keep in mind the hundreds of millions more who were obliterated by economic reactionism. If all rebellions were to be successfully repressed today and forever, free market autocracy's violence against humanity would be with us more unrestrained than ever. As is indeed happening. For these reasons, those of us who are genuinely concerned about democracy, social justice, and the survival of our planet should support rather than oppose popular revolutions. And that is the end of Chapter 2. Let us now praise revolution. This is why I've been reading this book. Although I believe this book, if I'm not mistaken, was finished in 97. Yeah, it was finished in 97, so when it's mentioned Libya, I'm like, just keep in mind it was finished in 97, because Libya is now a failed state with chattel slavery, thanks to Obama. And the whole entire oligarchs in the ruling class. Think about it. Obama's so great. Right. And this is why identity politics cannot, this is why I've learned to become, and still am learning to become a class reductionist. Because my skin folk drove a country into chattel slavery. Let that sink in. And I find this book, the more I dig into it, to be much more instructive and learn a lot from. Even a book that was written damn near 30 years ago. Oh, the things to learn from it. And again, I wish I discovered Michael Parenti much sooner, but better now than never. And with that, I am going to hop off for tonight. I'll continue these readings not just for this, but for my own political education. I'll probably do another reading on Friday. Yeah. Good night.